Close your eyes for one breath and open them again. The world you see did not blink into existence because you looked, but the way you see it, use it, and are changed by it, can shift dramatically the moment your awareness stops chasing myths and starts handling reality as it is. That is the heart of this promise. Change your reality using quantum consciousness, not as a slogan that flatters the ego, but as a precise way of living that fuses scientific clarity with spiritual seriousness. If you have felt tugged between two camps, videos that swear your mind creates the universe and scientists who roll their eyes, you are standing at the right doorway. The confusion ends here, and the transformation begins exactly where confusion used to live. For a century, the smallest scales of nature have humbled even the boldest minds. Light behaves like a wave and like a particle. Matter, electrons, atoms, does too. Interference patterns appear where common sense expects straight lines. Early pioneers stared at the double slit and wondered if observation itself made reality. Mystics rushed in, critics pushed back, and in the noise something essential was lost. An honest, elegant account of why patterns change when we measure, and how that truth, properly understood, can renovate your daily life. Here is the short line that changes the entire conversation. Reality is not conjured by your gaze. It is clarified by your interactions. In physics, that clarification is called decoherence, a fully physical process where contact with the environment destroys the delicate, in-sync wave relationships that produce interference. In life, the analogy is striking. The environments you allow, the inputs you accept, the habits you repeat, either preserve coherence in your purpose or scatter it. Your consciousness does not fabricate the moon. Your consciousness decides which world you inhabit within the one that already exists, focused, creative, steady, or noisy, fragmented, and borrowed. If you've ever felt your spiritual instinct collide with scientific doubt, if you've wanted a path that keeps both your soul and your sense, this is that path. We will honor the awe without abusing the math. We will walk from Newton and Huygens to Young and Arago, from Einstein to de Broglie and Davis and Germer, from Schrödinger and Born to Dieter Zay's decoherence in language anyone's grandmother could follow. By the end, you will see why the classical world looks solid, why the quantum world looks weird, and how this exact understanding becomes a method for changing your lived reality. Not by wishing outcomes into being, but by mastering the gates that shape attention, expectation, and action, your daily measurements that collapse possibilities into a life. If this already feels like a breath of clarity, subscribe to the channel now. It costs nothing and ensures these clean, steady explanations reach you right when the noise returns. Stay with me. Next, we'll separate poetry from physics and define what quantum consciousness truly means, so every step after that lands on solid ground. Before we travel through experiments and equations, we must clear the fog around the phrase itself. Quantum consciousness does not mean your mind is a cosmic wand that pops planets into existence when you glance their way. It does not mean the moon vanishes when you close your eyes, or that atoms wait breathlessly for your approval before they decide where to be. Those are poetic exaggerations that grew like vines around a few early puzzles in physics, and the vines have obscured the tree. What the science actually shows is more beautiful, more grounded, and, if you understand it correctly, far more empowering in daily life. Quantum theory describes how the tiniest ingredients of nature behave, and one of its surprises is that at very small scales, systems can travel like waves, overlapping possibilities, until interactions with their surroundings force those delicate possibilities to give way to a single, ordinary outcome. The key word is interactions. In physics, we call them measurements, but measurement is not a mystical stare. It is a physical exchange of information, light striking a surface, a detector nudging a particle, an environment brushing against a system until its subtle rhythms fall out of sync. That falling out of sync has a precise name: decoherence. When decoherence happens, interference vanishes, and you see the stable, classical world you expect. This is not your consciousness fabricating reality. It is reality responding to contact. So where does consciousness belong in a conversation like this? Not as a magician, but as a director of contact. Your awareness chooses which environments you live in, which inputs you let touch your attention, which actions you take that continually measure your world and force one of many possibilities to harden into your experience. Consciousness is not a supernatural override of physics. It is the steering wheel that decides which physics you feed. Think of the attention you give to an idea as the light you shine on it. Where you aim that beam, you increase the chance of interaction. Where interaction increases, options decohere into outcomes. In the lab, a detector changes a pattern because it physically disturbs the system. In life, a repeated habit changes your pattern because it physically, emotionally, and cognitively disturbs the field of possibilities around you, reinforcing one path and starving the others. The mechanism is different in detail, but the analogy is clean enough to live by. You are not conjuring reality, you are curating it. This matters because the old myth quietly disempowers you. If your mind supposedly creates the whole universe, any moment you feel small or stuck becomes an indictment. You must be doing reality wrong. The truth is saner and kinder. Much of reality stands without asking your opinion. Stars burn, tides rise, decay proceeds. But within that given world, there is a vast space your consciousness genuinely governs. What you notice first, what you permit to touch you, how quickly you return when you drift, which routines you ritualize until they become the rails your life runs on. That governance is not imaginary. It is the human-scale version of choosing which interactions dominate your day. Do you feed noise or signal, envy or gratitude, passive consumption or deliberate craft? Each choice is a measurement of sorts, collapsing your open morning into a specific afternoon. Seen this way, quantum consciousness is a practical vow. I will treat my awareness as a gatekeeper, not a spectator. I will choose the contacts that keep my purpose coherent and refuse the contacts that fracture it. There is also a humility baked into this view. Early interpreters looked at the double-slit experiment and concluded that observation creates reality because the interference vanished when we looked. What we now understand is that our looking required devices that touched the system, and that touch ruined the synchronized wave relationships that produce interference. The pattern changed not because we were mystical, but because we were clumsy. The lesson for life is exquisite. When your inner world feels noisy and contradictory, when you cannot tell which possibility you truly want, it is rarely because your destiny is broken. More often, your environment is clumsy. Too many conflicting contacts are battering your attention out of sync. The fix is not to wish harder. The fix is to refine your contacts until the pattern returns. Keep this compass as we move forward. We will honor real physics, not fairy dust. Light and matter do show dual identities. We will see how that was discovered and why it makes sense. But from the start, anchor this. Consciousness does not replace the world. It selects the world you will inhabit within the world that is already there. And because selection is ongoing, your reality can keep changing, quietly, steadily, like a laboratory that finally learned how not to spoil its own experiments. Next, we will step into history and watch the identity crisis of light itself unfold, so you can feel why the question ever arose and why the answer is more coherent than the slogans suggest. Before quantum ever entered the room, light itself forced the first rewrite of reality. Imagine two towering voices speaking past each other across a century. On one side, Isaac Newton, whose precision and prestige anchored the view that light travels as tiny corpuscles, particles shot like celestial grit. On the other, Christian Huygens, insisting that light ripples as a wave moving through space. Each camp held experiments, each spoke with confidence, and for a long stretch, Newton's authority set the tone. Yet the world is stubbornly honest with careful observers, and the tide turned when patterns appeared that particles alone could not explain. Thomas Young's double-slit demonstration painted a fabric of bright and dark bands on a screen, the unmistakable fingerprint of waves overlapping, amplifying here, cancelling there. A few years later, François Arago's Poisson spot drove the wedge deeper, a bright dot blooming in the dead center of a circular shadow, an effect only a wavefront could stage. With those two moments, light confessed a side of itself the particle story could not carry, and the conversation grew up. Reality, it seemed, was more than one thing at once. The humility of that discovery is easy to miss because the diagrams look tidy now. In the rooms where it happened, it was chaos and wonder. Young's setup looked laughably simple: 2 narrow openings, a distant screen, a faint lamp. Yet from that minimal theatre emerged an interference pattern that no amount of debate could erase. The bands did not care whose theory you preferred. They arrived whenever the conditions preserved phase, the delicate in-step relationship that lets one ripple lift another or lay it flat. Huygens' wave picture, once sidelined, found its proof in the very geometry of the pattern, where crests met crests, brightness. Where crest met trough, darkness. Arago's central spot did the same with different scenery, taking the shadow cast by a disc and revealing a luminous seed right where intuition expected nothing. The message landed. Light can conduct itself as a wave, not as metaphor, but as measurement, and any faithful account of reality must make room for that behavior. But the story did not end by crowning waves and burying particles. It deepened by refusing a false choice. Later work would return with equal force to show that light sometimes behaves like localized quanta, discrete packets that kick electrons from metal or scatter with measurable jabs. The real lesson of this earlier chapter is not pick a side, but watch the conditions. When nothing interferes and the phases hold, light writes poetry across the screen as a wave. When interactions dominate, when contact localizes and exchanges energy in sharp steps, light answers like a particle. This is not a trick. It is a portrait of a world that changes dialect depending on how you speak to it. Carry that nuance into your own life. If your days feel like static, ask whether your conditions preserve coherence or break it. The interference fringes of your focus, those repeating rhythms where work flows and ideas click, appear only when you protect the quiet relationships among your inputs. Too many collisions and the pattern vanishes. That is not failure. It is feedback. Adjust the scene and the signal returns. If this perspective just clicked for you, drop the word coherence in the comments so I know you're tracking and ready to go deeper. Next, we invite matter onto the stage. If light can play both roles, can electrons and atoms do the same? The answer, when it arrived, did more than surprise. It rewrote what stuff even means. Once light confessed its double life, an audacious question followed almost immediately. If photons can act like waves and particles, why should matter be exempt? Louis de Broglie, with a mixture of elegance and nerve, proposed that every material object carries a wavelength, subtle for large things and significant for the very small, with the precise length set by its momentum. He was not playing with metaphor. He wrote a concrete relation that gave the wave a scale. In that instant, stuff ceased to be a rigid category. Electrons, protons, atoms, whatever you thought of as solid, now wore a hidden rhythm that might, under the right conditions, show itself the way light had in Young's fringes. The idea needed more than charm. It needed a screen painted with evidence. A few years later, Davison and Germer gave it that screen. They fired electrons at a nickel crystal and watched as the scattered spray arranged itself into clear interference peaks, precise angles of brightness and absence that only waves could draw. An electron beam, when the environment preserved phase, did not behave like buckshot. It behaved like ripples interfering. The result was not a philosophical flourish. It was a laboratory fact, one that locked de Broglie's daring into the spine of physics. But waves are not merely pictures. They are tools, and Erwin Schrödinger supplied the instrument that could sing them into predictions. He wrote an equation, compact, austere, that tells you how a system's wave function evolves, how possibilities flow in time, how a packet of maybes spreads or holds shape depending on the landscape it moves through. The wave function is not a fog of ghost stuff smearing matter across the room. It is a finely tuned book of odds, a map of where outcomes will most likely appear if you let the system run and then compel it to answer a concrete question. That last piece, How to Read the Map, arrived with Max Born, who taught the world to stop arguing about what the wave is and start using it to calculate what you will see. Square the wave function, and you get a probability density, a contour of likelihoods. Bright regions in that abstract space mean expect hits here more often. Dim regions mean rarely there, and the total adds up exactly as honest probabilities do. With that rule, the misty language evaporated. Interference patterns were no longer mystical veils. They were probability landscapes, the statistical fingerprints of waves adding and cancelling within the equation's governance. This is the point where the narrative becomes both subtle and practical. If matter carries a wave function that predicts where it tends to show up, then the world is not split between ethereal possibility and hard fact. It is stitched together by a process that moves from one to the other whenever real interactions occur. Left to itself, an electron's wave function will evolve smoothly, spreading or bending as conditions dictate, allowing distinct paths to interfere just as ripples on a pond do. Touch it with a measuring device, scatter light from it, let it collide with a detector, and the elegant choreography stops being in step. The phases that allowed interference get scrambled by the contact, and the pattern you would have seen gives way to a localized outcome you can point at. That shift is not a supernatural collapse. It is the expected consequence of coupling a delicate system to a noisy world. In the small, carefully isolated theater of an experiment, you can cradle coherence long enough to watch matter behave like a wave. In the big, bustling theater of daily life, everything rubs against everything else, and the wave relationships shred too quickly to notice. What remains looks like the crisp, definite world we trust. Understanding this machine rescues you from two opposite mistakes. The first is romanticizing the wave, as if possibility were more real than presence, as if you could live forever in the realm of maybe without paying the cost of contact. The second is flattening reality to only hard pellets bumping in the dark, denying the genuine richness of conditions where subtle patterns shape outcomes. The truth composed by de Broglie, Davison-Germer, Schrödinger and Born is kinder than both extremes. It says that matter carries a lawful openness that narrows to an event when the world and the system truly meet, and that our best mathematics can forecast the distribution of those events with exquisite accuracy. In human terms, it suggests that your days are fields of potential that take on shape when you allow specific interactions to dominate. Leave your attention unguarded and the pattern smears into noise. Choose your contacts deliberately and the distribution sharpens around the life you are building. You are not conjuring electrons into being with a glance. You are learning the art of arranging conditions so that meaningful outcomes appear more often. The way a crystal, by its order, steers a beam into bright angles instead of a dull blur. Keep that lens as we move forward. Early pioneers struggled not because they were foolish, but because they lacked the language of decoherence and the tools to isolate or disturb systems with today's precision. Their questions were right. Some of their conclusions were hasty. Next, we will revisit the double slit with detectors in hand. Listen to Bohr and Heisenberg frame the stakes. Hear Einstein's moon haunt the debate, and watch how a single word, observation, misled a generation into mysticism when interaction would have told the truth. Return to the spare stage where the drama first became undeniable. A plate with two narrow openings, a source whispering quanta one by one, and a screen patiently collecting truth. With both slits open and no interference from us, the screen blossoms into alternating bands, bright where crests reinforce and dark where crest and trough cancel. This is not metaphor, it is geometry in motion, a portrait of phases holding steady as possibilities overlap. Now place a device by one slit to learn which path each quantum took. The blooming vanishes. Where poetry once appeared, you find a more pedestrian distribution, as if pellets had chosen one door or the other and smacked the wall accordingly. In the early telling, we called this a collapse brought on by observation and dressed the moment with mystical overtones, as though nature turned shy when watched. The language charmed audiences and confused generations because it hid the mechanical fact. The detector must touch what it measures. To gain which path information, you scatter light from the particle or couple it to some auxiliary system that can carry the mark forward. That touch, no matter how gentle, scrambles the delicate phase relations the interference pattern requires. The silence on the screen is not a tantrum thrown by the universe. It is the bill presented for the contact you demanded. Bohr and Heisenberg tried to give this exchange a grammar when instruments were clumsy and theory was newborn. Their insistence was not that consciousness controls reality, but that the question you ask helps shape the stage on which nature can answer. Design the apparatus to preserve phase and the world replies in waves. Design it to extract path information and the world replies in localized hits. Complementarity is the name Bohr pinned to this disciplined humility. The same system cannot, under the same conditions, reveal all its faces at once. The double slit is not a circus trick. It is a boundary stone that tells you how knowledge must be gathered if it is to remain honest. Yet the words they used, observation, collapse, measurement, were soaked with human meaning, and that soaked meaning bled into the science. People began to imagine that a stare from a mind flips a cosmic switch, and the beauty of the insight was drowned by theater. Einstein's resistance was not petty stubbornness. It was a craftsman's refusal to let sloppy phrasing pass for explanation. His moonline was not a joke. It was a demand that reality be reality even when no one is applauding it. He did not deny the disappearance of fringes under measurement. He denied that a human gaze should be enthroned as the cause. Decades later, with sharper instruments and clearer mathematics, his instinct found its channel. The work that matured into decoherence said, in effect, that what we called collapse is the natural consequence of letting a fragile quantum system bleed information into its surroundings. The environment becomes an unwitting witness, picking up phase details and thereby destroying the very coherence those details depend on to matter. You do not need a mind to watch. The air is already watching. The table is already watching. Stray photons are already watching. Their watching is not conscious, but it is physical, and that is enough to ruin interference. To see how practical this is, hold in your imagination a beam whose phases are aligned, a quiet choir of possibilities singing the same pitch. Now bring a detector close. The detector's internal degrees of freedom act like a jostling crowd, bumping the choir members out of time with one another. A few fall behind the beat, a few rush ahead, and soon no unified song remains to interfere with itself. The resulting pattern looks classical, not because the system forgot how to be quantum, but because its quantumness is now smeared across so many uncontrolled links to the world that no single coherent story survives. If you could, with extreme care, reverse those links, return the jostled choir to a common tempo, you would watch the fringes bloom again. Modern which-path eraser and recoherence experiments in their careful theaters have done exactly that, not by invoking thoughts, but by untying knots of interaction that earlier setups tied without mercy. This reframing rescues the word observation from superstition and gives measurement back its hands. Measurement is a conversation written in exchanges of energy and information. Choose a conversation that preserves phase and you will see wave signatures. Choose one that extracts definite facts about location or momentum, and you will pay with coherence. The double slit becomes a parable about costs rather than a hymn to psychic power. You can have knowledge of the path, or you can have interference, but you cannot, within the same arrangement, keep both. The laboratory learns to choose. The mature mind, too, must learn to choose. There are seasons when you design your day to guard coherence, quiet inputs, long spans of undisturbed work, conditions that let ideas overlap and reinforce. There are seasons when you design for decisive facts, calls made, decisions taken, results delivered, and you accept that such contact roughens the subtler patterns. Confusion creeps in when you demand both at once, the way early interpreters demanded waves that survive a poke. Life answers with the same strictness the experiment does: protect or probe, sing or specify, but do not pretend you can keep every option pristine while you put your hands on everything. The Copenhagen spirit, stripped of glamour, is an ethic of honest questioning. It says that reality will not be bullied into revealing what your apparatus refuses to respect. Einstein's counter-spirit, stripped of caricature, is an ethic of objectivity. It says that the world keeps being the world without your supervision. Decoherence holds both ethics at once. It affirms that nature is always there and always lawful, and it explains why your way of touching it changes what you get to see. When you pack too many interactions into a delicate scene, the phases that carry depth are lost, and only blunt facts remain. When you isolate the scene with patience, the depth returns as reliable structure, not as mystic indulgence. The difference is not belief. It is design. Carry this into how you shape a week. If you feel the loss of your own fringes, those bands of creative clarity where new combinations appear, do not diagnose yourself as dull or invoke fate against you. Diagnose the contacts. Too many pings, too much glare, too many stray couplings to environments that do not care about your purpose will always flatten subtlety into sludge. The fix is gentle and architectural. Guard the first hour so the choir can tune before the crowd arrives. Place fewer detectors next to your slits by reducing low-value notifications and preventing idle collisions in your attention. Create pockets of isolation where phase can hold long enough for good patterns to form. Then, when you need to ship, invite clean interactions on purpose and accept the cost with eyes open. You are not making the universe blink into being. You are building an apparatus worthy of the answer you seek. Seen this way, the double slit is no longer a hall of mirrors where consciousness tries on crowns. It is a teacher of boundaries, a friend to precision, and a rebuke to both cynicism and wishcraft. It tells you that the smallest things are honest about the price of knowledge and that honesty scales elegantly to human days. You do not have to believe in magic to have a life that looks like one from the outside. You need only the humility to protect coherence when it matters, and the courage to make contact when it is time to decide. From here, the final pieces fall into place. Why big objects almost never show wave behavior, how the environment turns superpositions into everyday facts, and how the same clarity that tames a paradox can become the method by which you change the way you live. Imagine stepping into your morning the way a careful experimentalist steps into a clean room. You do not barge in with noise. You pass through thresholds that slow you down. You let stray dust fall away. You remember why you came. The first thing you tend is the source, the quiet lamp of attention that everything else depends on. You do not yank it to full brightness and scorch the room. You bring it up slowly until the edges of one worthy problem appear, the way a dim beam reveals the contours of a slit without flooding the scene. In that measured light, paths separate. You can feel which tasks belong to each opening and which ones are decoys that only scatter you. The discipline is not in heroics. It is in refusing to crowd the geometry with extra hands. If you want interference, the creative overlap, where two half-ideas add into more than either could be alone, you must let the wavefront run in time. That demands a gentleness that looks from the outside like idleness, but is actually the strongest kind of work, guarding phase. There will be hours when the world is already touching you through a dozen channels, and you can feel the pattern flattening as clearly as if you were watching the bands wash away on a screen. Here, the temptation is to push harder, to shout clarity into existence. The wiser move is smaller. You trace where the jostling entered. Did a memory open that you did not mean to feed? Did a conversation leave a residual hum? Did the room begin to glare because you swung the lamp too quickly from one subject to the next? Each of those is a contact. Each can be softened. You dial back a brightness, you finish one emotional loop before starting another. You give your body 3 quiet breaths that act like shutters closing on a lens, and the choir inside you finds its pitch again. Nothing mystical happened. You did what a good lab does when interference fades. Remove the noisy couplings and wait long enough for the in-step motion to return. Some days are dedicated to preserving song. You build them with long spans of uninterrupted work and small pockets of restoration that keep your rhythm steady. You walk not to escape the task, but to metabolize it, letting steps carry one idea past another until they begin to link. You read like a mason, placing one stone of thought on top of another and tapping it until it sits flush, instead of dumping a pile of bricks you will never set. You speak less because words jostle, and you choose the few sentences that actually strengthen the lattice you are building. In such a day, the screen by nightfall does not look spectacular. It looks inevitable. You can see the bright bands where attention doubled on itself and darker bands where you wisely said no. It is a picture you can trust. Other days are built like detectors. You invite contact and you accept its price. You pick up the phone and let another person's world collide with yours. You walk through a messy spreadsheet and force numbers to answer honestly. You ship a draft that is not precious because drafts become precious only after they have learned to take a punch. In these hours, you stop demanding interference and make peace with pellets. You are not betraying your quantum vows. You are honoring complementarity in a human key. There is a time for subtlety and a time for decision. And the miracle is that you can move between them without tearing anything if you do it consciously. You make the switch the way a physicist marks a page in the lab book and changes the apparatus with care. You even pause for a breath between modes so your nervous system learns the difference and does not keep you vibrating when you ought to be precise. There is a craft to repairing a day that has already lost coherence. You do not declare it ruined. You treat it like a witch path eraser. You identify the channels where the environment is recording you against your will. You close the tab that never deserved a tab. You step outside and let the air thin the noise that accumulated indoors. You finish one small act cleanly. Wash the single dish, send the single sentence, fold the single shirt, because completion is a signal that tells scattered parts of you to agree on something. The mind misreads this as triviality. The body recognizes it as a handshake. Soon, the off-tempo voices begin to realign, and a few minutes later, the fringes are faintly visible again. You did not bully a miracle into being. You merely unknotted enough tangles for the latent pattern to reappear. Relationships belong in this room as well, and they obey the same physics of contact. Some people amplify your phase. They arrive softly, ask clean questions, and leave you more in step with yourself than before they entered. Others are not bad. They are simply loud in ways that keep you from hearing your own pitch. The mistake is not in loving them. The mistake is in designing your apparatus as if their presence were neutral. If a conversation always leaves you buzzing, you do not have to make a speech about boundaries. You schedule the talk on a detector day, not a coherence day, and you end 5 minutes before the hour, so the choir has time to retune. If a partner or friend helps you hold phase, you give them a seat near the source and let them see the pattern take shape before it is fragile enough to be spoiled by careless handling. Love becomes precise when you admit that attention has acoustics. Purpose belongs here too, and it is quieter than most people are willing to be. The grand declarations that gather likes are usually a kind of glare. Real direction feels like a well-collimated beam, narrow, bright, unhurried. You discover it by noticing which questions keep surviving contact. Many ambitions look radiant until they touch the table and wobble. A few not only survive, they sharpen. Pay attention to those. When you find one, treat it like a slit you cut with care. Do not make it wider than it needs to be. Do not clutter its edge with half-promises. Aim the beam through it daily until the screen begins to show the repeating outline of a life you recognize. If the pattern shifts, you do not panic. You adjust the angle, you check for dust, you keep the lamp steady, and you trust that geometry rewards patience. There will be seasons when your apparatus must evolve. A new child, a new job, an illness, a loss. Each is an environmental change, and pretending otherwise is a fast way to lose every fringe in 1 week. You honor the change by rebuilding the room. You shorten sessions, you lower expectations that belong to a different climate. You learn the new noise profile of your days and discover when the choir can still sing. The humility this requires is not defeat. It is engineering. The universe never asked you to keep the same settings forever. It asked you to learn how settings work. All of this can be lived without slogans. You do not have to announce that you are doing quantum. You notice that you are less easily scattered than last month. You notice that your sentences land with more weight because they grew in a room with fewer collisions. You notice that opportunities arrive as sequences rather than storms. People will tell you that you are lucky. You will smile because you know the luck has a blueprint and that anyone with a lamp and a door and a wall can begin. The secret is not secrecy. The secret is fidelity to small, repeatable acts that protect phase long enough for patterns to show. In the end, the apparatus of a life is a posture more than a plan. It is the way you hold the beam and the steadiness with which you keep your promises to the room you carry inside. On some days you will fail, and on some you will astonish yourself. Both are data. Both can be folded back into the design. If you keep listening, even your missteps will teach you where the detectors are hiding, and that knowledge becomes part of the architecture. Build this way long enough and the line between mystery and method softens. You will still be surprised, but you will rarely be lost. And when you are asked how you changed your reality, you will tell the truth without drama. I learned to touch my world the way a careful scientist touches theirs, on purpose, at the right times, and gently enough for the pattern to return. Now the fog has thinned. Quantum mechanics never required you to believe that your gaze manufactures the cosmos. It showed that interactions decide what appears. In experiments, a detector's touch scatters phase and the fringes fade. In life, stray inputs do the same to your focus. Decoherence is how electrons lose their patterns, and how our days lose their depth. The remedy is identical in both theaters. Protect what must stay in phase, then make contact on purpose when it is time to choose. That is not mysticism, it is craftsmanship. Carry this creed forward. Patterns you love require conditions you must protect. Give yourself one guarded hour with no detectors pinging your attention. Aim your awareness at a worthy question long enough for a clean pattern to form. Then invite a decisive interaction. Ship the work, make the call, move the body, and let the maybes harden into a result. Wonder survives the rigor because reality deserves both. If this shifted something in you, mark the moment. Comment coherence below. And if you want more calm, precise explanations that respect both your soul and your sense, subscribe to the channel now. It costs nothing and keeps this signal reaching you when the noise returns. Thank you for your time and trust. Keep your field clean, your decisions steady, and your curiosity alive. Be well, stay coherent, and I'll see you in the next one.